Theodore Robert Bundy, also known as Cowell, was an American serial killer who terrorized the nation by kidnapping, raping, and murdering numerous young women and girls throughout the 1970s, and potentially even earlier. Despite denying his involvement for over a decade, Bundy eventually confessed to committing 30 murders across 7 states between 1974 and 1978. However, the actual number of victims he claimed is believed to be much higher. Bundy was known for his charming and attractive demeanor, which he used to manipulate both his victims and society at large. He would often approach women in public places, feigning a physical disability or impersonating an authority figure in order to win their trust. Once he had gained their confidence, he would lure them away, bludgeon them unconscious, and take them to another location to sexually assault and kill them. Bundy frequently returned to the corpses of his victims, engaging in grooming and sexual acts until their bodies were destroyed by decomposition and wild animals. Shockingly, he kept the severed heads of at least 12 of his victims as grim mementos in his apartment. On some occasions, he even broke into homes in the dead of night to attack his victims as they slept. In 1975, Bundy's criminal activity caught up with him when he was arrested and imprisoned in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. This led to him being investigated as a potential suspect in a growing number of unsolved homicides across multiple states. Despite facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy managed to orchestrate 2 daring escapes and continued to commit further assaults, including 3 more murders in Florida, before eventually being recaptured in 1978. He was eventually given 3 death sentences for the Florida homicides after 2 trials, and was executed at Florida State Prison in Rayford on January 24, 1989. Ann Rule, Bundy's biographer, characterized him as a sadistic sociopath, who took pleasure in the pain of others and the control he held over his victims, even after their deaths. Bundy himself once referred to himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet, a sentiment that was echoed by his attorney, Paulie Nelson, who served on his final defense team. Nelson wrote that Bundy was the very definition of heartless evil. Theodore Robert Cowell, later known as Ted Bundy, was born on November 24, 1946, to Eleanor Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. The identity of his biological father has never been definitively established, as his original birth certificate listed his father as unknown and assigned paternity to a man named Lloyd Marshall in another version. Louise claimed that a war veteran named Jack Worthington was his father, but several men by the name of John Worthington and Lloyd Marshall lived near Louise when Bundy was conceived, leading some family members to speculate that Bundy might have been fathered by Louise's own father. However, a DNA test conducted on a sample of Bundy's blood in the 2020 documentary film Crazy, Not Insane, revealed that he was not the product of incest. Bundy spent the first 3 years of his life in the home of his maternal grandparents, Samuel Knecht Cowell and Eleanor Miriam Cowell née Longstreet, who raised him as their own son to avoid the stigma attached to unwed mothers at that time. Bundy was told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. He later learned the truth, although the circumstances of his discovery are disputed. Bundy resented his mother for never discussing his true father with him, and for leaving him to uncover his parentage on his own. True crime writer Ann Rule, who knew Bundy personally, wrote that he did not learn the truth until he found his original birth record in Vermont in 1969. Bundy displayed troubling behavior during his early years. According to Louise's younger sister Julia, Bundy stood smiling beside her bed while she was surrounded by kitchen knives after waking up from a nap when he was only 3 years old. Additionally, his childhood neighbor Sandy Holt described him as a bully who enjoyed inflicting pain, suffering, and fear on others. Despite this, Bundy had a close relationship with his grandparents, whom he identified with and respected. However, in 1987, Bundy and other family members reported that his grandfather Samuel was an abusive bully who beat his wife and dog and exhibited bigotry, while his grandmother was a timid woman who underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression. Nonetheless, these characterizations have been challenged in recent investigations. Some locals remembered Samuel as a fine man, and a cousin of Bundy believed that negative descriptions of him were invented to explain Bundy's actions as a serial killer. Additionally, Louise's sister Audrey stated that their mother suffered a stroke due to obesity, not mental illness, and was unable to leave her home. In 1950, to avoid social stigma, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson and moved to Tacoma, Washington with her son Ted to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott. She met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook, at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church in 1951. They married later that year, and Johnny formally adopted Ted. Johnny and Louise had 4 children together, but Ted remained distant from his adoptive father. He complained to a girlfriend that Johnny was not his real father, wasn't very bright, and didn't make much money. Bundy gave varying accounts of his time in Tacoma in later years. To Michaud and Ainsworth, he described picking through trash barrels in search of pictures of naked women while roaming his neighborhood. To attorney and author Polly Nelson, he claimed to have perused detective magazines, crime novels, and true crime documentaries for stories involving sexual violence, especially those illustrated with pictures of dead or maimed women. However, in a letter to Rule, he denied ever reading fact detective magazines and shuddered at the thought that anyone would. He also told Michaud that he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or whatever else could be seen. There are varying accounts of Bundy's social life. According to journalists Michaud and Ainsworth, he claimed to have chosen to be alone during his adolescence because he did not understand interpersonal relationships and had no sense of how to develop friendships. However, classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School described him as well-known and well-liked, and he was considered a medium-sized fish in a large pond. Despite being an average student, Bundy was an avid downhill skier and pursued the activity with great enthusiasm, often using stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. He was arrested multiple times during high school on suspicion of burglary and motor vehicle theft, but the details of these incidents were expunged from his record when he turned 18, as is customary in Washington and many other states. After finishing high school in 1965, Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound, UPS, for a year before transferring to the University of Washington, UW, to study Chinese. There he met Diane Edwards, a fellow student, and they began a relationship in 1967. In early 1968, Bundy dropped out of college and worked several low-paying jobs while volunteering at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign. He also became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington state. Edwards graduated in the spring of 1968 and moved to San Francisco, and Bundy visited her there after earning a scholarship to study Chinese at Stanford University during the summer. In August of 1968, Bundy attended the Republican National Convention in Miami as a Rockefeller delegate. Soon after, Edwards ended their relationship, citing Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis later identified this as a critical moment in Bundy's development. He was devastated by the breakup and traveled to Colorado before visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia. He also spent 1 semester at Temple University during this time. Rule believed that it was during this period, in early 1969, that Bundy visited the birth records office in Burlington and confirmed his true parentage. In 1969, Bundy returned to Washington and met Elizabeth Kloepfer, a single mother from Ogden, Utah who worked as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. Their relationship, which was identified in Bundy literature by various pseudonyms including Meg Anders, Beth Archer, or Liz Kendall, was tumultuous and continued even after his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. Bundy acted as a father figure to Kloepfer's daughter Molly, who was 3 years old when they started dating, and remained in her life until she was 10 and he had been arrested. However, as an adult, Molly reported that Bundy had been abusive and sexually inappropriate with her since the age of 7. These incidents included Bundy hitting her, knocking her down, putting her in danger of drowning, indecent exposure, and sexual touching disguised as accidents or games. In mid-1970, Bundy enrolled again at UW, this time as a psychology major, and became an honor student who was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center where he worked alongside Ann Rule, a former Seattle police officer and aspiring crime writer who would later write one of the definitive Bundy biographies, The Stranger Beside Me. At the time, Rule did not see anything disturbing in Bundy's personality, and described him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. After completing his undergraduate studies in 1972, Bundy worked for Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign, posing as a college student to shadow Evans's opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, and record his speeches for analysis. Bundy was appointed to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, and after Evans was re-elected, he landed a job as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Bundy was accepted into the law schools of UPS and the University of Utah in 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, thanks to letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several UW psychology professors. During a trip to California in the summer of 1973, Bundy reunited with Edwards and continued to court her, even as he continued to date Chloe Pfer, who was unaware of Edwards's existence. In the fall of 1973, Bundy began attending UPS Law School while continuing to pursue Edwards. They discussed marriage, and he introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. However, in January 1974, Bundy abruptly cut off all contact with Edwards, refusing to explain why. When she finally reached him a month later, he denied any knowledge of their relationship and hung up. Bundy later claimed he wanted to prove to himself that he could have married her, but Edwards believed that he had planned their entire courtship and rejection in advance as revenge for their breakup in 1968. By April of 1974, Bundy had stopped attending law school and young women were beginning to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. There is no consensus on the time or place that Bundy began his killing spree. He provided different accounts to different individuals and refused to disclose the details of his earliest crimes, even as he openly confessed to dozens of later murders in the days prior to his execution. According to Bundy, he attempted his first kidnapping in 1969 in Ocean City, New Jersey, but did not kill anyone until approximately 1971 in Seattle. In contrast, he informed psychologist Art Norman that he killed 2 women in Atlantic City while visiting family in Philadelphia in 1969. Additionally, Bundy hinted to homicide detective Robert D. Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in 1972 and another in 1973 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater, but he refused to elaborate. Although Rule and Keppel both speculated that he may have started killing as a teenager, Bundy's earliest confirmed murders took place in 1974 when he was 27 years old. By that point, he claimed to have mastered the necessary skills to leave minimal forensic evidence at crime scenes, during a time when DNA profiling was not yet available. Around the time he ended his relationship with Edwards, Bundy entered the basement apartment of Karen Sparks, also known as Joni Lentz, Mary Adams, and Terry Caldwell in various sources, an 18-year-old dancer and University of Washington student, shortly after midnight on January 4, 1974. Using a metal rod from her bed frame, he bludgeoned Sparks and sexually assaulted her with either the same rod or a metal speculum, causing significant internal injuries. Sparks survived but was left with physical disabilities after remaining unconscious in the hospital for 10 days. On February 1, Bundy broke into the basement room of Linda Ann Healy, a UW undergraduate who provided morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots, and then took her away. During the first half of 1974, female college students were disappearing at a rate of about 1 per month. Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, went missing on March 12 after leaving her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus. On April 17, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while walking to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, located 110 miles, 175 kilometers, southeast of Seattle. 2 female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters with a man wearing a sling who was asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle, one on the night of Rancourt's disappearance, and the other 3 nights earlier. On May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, which is 260 miles, 420 kilometers, south of Seattle, to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but never arrived. Seattle and King County investigators were becoming increasingly worried as they found little physical evidence and the missing women shared only a similar appearance: young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. Their concerns heightened after Brenda Carroll Ball, 22, disappeared on June 1 after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. The situation worsened when University of Washington student Georgianne Hawkins vanished in the early hours of June 11 while walking down a well-lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. The following day, a criminalist and 3 Seattle homicide detectives searched the entire alleyway on their hands and knees but found nothing. Bundy later admitted to luring Hawkins to his car, knocking her out with a crowbar, handcuffing her, and driving her to Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles, 30 kilometers, east of Seattle. There, he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. The next day, in the midst of a major crime scene investigation, Bundy returned to the UW alleyway and retrieved Hawkins's earrings and one of her shoes from where he had left them in the adjoining parking lot. Bundy's bold move left investigators astonished. He later revisited Hawkins's corpse 3 times. Following Hawkins's disappearance, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man struggling to carry a briefcase on crutches with a leg cast in an alley behind a nearby dormitory on the night of her disappearance. One woman remembered the man asking for help carrying the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. During this time, Bundy was employed in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, where he authored a pamphlet on rape prevention for women. Later, he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, DEA, a state government agency that was involved in the search for the missing women. At the DEA, Bundy met and began dating Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced mother of 2 who would play a crucial role in the final phase of his life 6 years later. Reports of Bundy's brutal attack on Sparks and the disappearances of 6 women received widespread coverage in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. The public became increasingly fearful, and the number of young women hitchhiking declined sharply. Law enforcement agencies faced mounting pressure to solve the case, but the lack of physical evidence hindered their efforts. Police kept the few available details from reporters to avoid compromising the investigation. Further similarities among the victims were noted. The disappearances occurred at night, often near construction sites, and within a week of midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans when they disappeared. And witnesses reported seeing a man with a cast or sling driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle at many of the crime scenes. The series of murders that took place in Oregon and Washington reached a climax on July 14 when 2 women were abducted from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah in broad daylight. 4 female witnesses reported encountering an attractive young man, referred to as Ted, who had his left arm in a sling and was wearing a white tennis outfit. He spoke with a light accent, possibly Canadian or British, and requested their assistance in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 3 of the witnesses declined, while 1 accompanied him to his car and fled after realizing there was no sailboat. 3 other witnesses saw him approach Janice Anna, who left with him, and 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund disappeared. Bundy claimed to have murdered both women, and to have forced one to watch him kill the other, although he later denied it. The King County Police finally received a detailed description of the suspect and his vehicle, and distributed flyers with a composite sketch throughout the Seattle area. Chloe Pfer, Rule, a DEA employee, and a UW psychology professor all recognized Bundy as a possible suspect, but detectives received numerous tips and initially discounted the possibility that a clean-cut law student with no criminal record could be the culprit. On September 6, the remains of Ott and Naslund were discovered by 2 hunters near a service road in Issaquah, while additional remains were found 6 months later by forestry students from Green River Community College on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy often hiked. The recovered remains were identified as belonging to Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball, although the remains of Manson were never found. Bundy lived in a rooming house in Salt Lake City from September 1974 to October 1975, which he used as a base for his murderous activities. He utilized the fire escape to sneak into his room and also concealed photo souvenirs of his murders in the utility room, which had windows. During this time, Bundy was studying law at the University of Utah, but he struggled with the coursework and felt inferior to his fellow students. In August 1974, he received his second acceptance from the law school, which led to his move to Salt Lake City, leaving his girlfriend, Chloe Pfeiffer, behind in Seattle. Bundy dated multiple other women while in Salt Lake City and maintained contact with Chloe Pfeiffer through frequent phone calls. In September 1974, Bundy began a new string of homicides that included 2 victims whose remains were not discovered until later. On September 2, he raped and strangled an unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, disposing of her remains in a nearby river or returning to photograph and dismember her corpse. On October 2, he abducted Nancy Wilcox, a 16-year-old girl from Holiday, Utah, and informed investigators that her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, but they were never found. On October 18, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a police chief from Midvale, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor. Her nude body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later, with post-mortem examination indicating that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days after her disappearance. On October 31, Laura Ann Aim, also 17, disappeared from Lehigh after leaving a cafe. Her naked body was found by hikers in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day, 9 miles away from where she was last seen. Both girls had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Bundy later described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and Aim, including hair shampooing and applying makeup. On November 8, Bundy approached Carol Durank, an 18-year-old telephone operator, at Fashion Place Mall in Murray. He posed as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told Durank that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint, but when Durank realized they were not headed to the police station, Bundy tried to handcuff her. In their struggle, he accidentally fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and Durank was able to escape. Later that evening, Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student, disappeared from Viewmont High School in Bountiful, and a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Duranka's wrist was found outside the school's auditorium. In November, after reading news of young women disappearing around Salt Lake City, Chloe Pfeiffer contacted the King County Police for the second time. Detective Randy Hergesheimer from the Major Crimes Division interviewed her thoroughly. At this point, Bundy had moved up the ranks of suspicion in King County, but the Lake Sammamish witness, who was deemed the most reliable by investigators, failed to identify him from a photo lineup. In December, Chloe Pfeiffer contacted the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office again and voiced her suspicions. Bundy was added to the list of suspects, but there was no solid forensic evidence linking him to the crimes in Utah. After finishing his final exams in January 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle and spent a week with Chloe Pfeiffer, who did not disclose her 3 prior reports to the authorities. They made plans for her to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. During 1975, Bundy changed his focus of criminal activities to Colorado from Utah. On January 12, a registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, which is approximately 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. A month later, her nude body was found next to a dirt road outside the resort, bearing deep cuts and distinctive linear grooved depressions on her skull from a blunt instrument. Then, on March 15, Vail ski instructor Julie Cunningham went missing while walking to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later admitted to approaching her on crutches and asking for help before clubbing, handcuffing, sexually assaulting, and strangling her at a secondary site near Rifle. Denise Lynn Oliverson disappeared on April 6 while riding her bicycle near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction. Her bike and sandals were later found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. On May 6, Bundy abducted 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, which is approximately 160 miles north of Salt Lake City, and drowned her in his hotel room before disposing of her body in a river, likely the Snake River, north of Pocatello. Karen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway to her hotel room. Later, in mid-May, Bundy's co-workers from Washington State, including Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed with him for a week. In early June, Bundy visited Kloepfer in Seattle for a week and they talked about getting married the following Christmas. Despite Kloepfer's multiple discussions with authorities in King County and Salt Lake County, she did not mention them to Bundy. Bundy also kept his ongoing relationship with Boone in a concurrent romance with a Utah law student named Kim Andrews or Sharon Auer secret from Kloepfer. On June 28, Susan Curtis disappeared from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, 45 miles, 70 kilometers, south of Salt Lake City. Her murder became Bundy's final confession, which was tape-recorded just before his execution. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culver, and Curtis were never found. In August or September 1975, Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, although he did not actively participate in services and ignored most church restrictions. The LDS Church later excommunicated him following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. After his arrest, when asked about his religious preference, Bundy said he was Methodist, the religion of his childhood. Investigators in Washington state faced a daunting challenge as they tried to make sense of the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended abruptly. To help make sense of the large volume of data they had gathered, they resorted to an innovative strategy at the time, creating a database. Using the King County payroll computer, which was considered huge and primitive by contemporary standards but the only one available to them, they inputted numerous lists they had compiled, including classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders, and others. They then queried the computer for coincidences and found 26 names on 4 lists, including Ted Bundy. In addition to this, detectives manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, with Bundy at the top of the pile. However, before they could make an arrest, word came from Utah that Bundy had already been taken into custody. On August 16, 1975, Ted Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Bundy was observed by Hayward cruising a residential area in his Volkswagen Beetle during the pre-dawn hours and fleeing at high speed upon seeing the patrol car. When Hayward searched the car, he found several suspicious items such as a ski mask, a second mask made of pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other tools. Bundy tried to explain that the items were for skiing. He found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect and car description from the November 1974 Durant kidnapping, and Bundy's name from Kloepfer's phone call a month later. Upon searching Bundy's apartment, the police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark by the Wildwood Inn, and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Ken had disappeared. Bundy was not detained as the police did not have enough evidence against him. He later claimed that searchers missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed after he was released. After his release, Salt Lake City police placed Bundy under 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Bundy's girlfriend, Kloepfer. She told them about discovering strange objects in their house and Bundy's apartment in the year before his move to Utah. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris, a meat cleaver, surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case, and a sack full of women's clothing. Bundy was always in debt, and Kloepfer suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. She also shared that Bundy warned her not to tell anyone when she confronted him about a new TV and stereo. Furthermore, Bundy became very agitated whenever Kloepfer considered cutting her hair, and she sometimes found him examining her body in the middle of the night with a flashlight. He even kept a lug wrench, taped halfway up the handle, in the trunk of her Volkswagen Beetle car for protection. After Thompson's investigation, it was confirmed that Bundy was not with Kloepfer on any of the nights when the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished, nor on the day Ott and Naslund were abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park. Kloepfer was later interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney and learned of Diane Edwards and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas 1973. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a teenager from Midvale, Utah. The car was impounded by the police and searched by FBI technicians, who found hairs matching those taken from the body of victim Campbell. Later, they also found hair strands that were microscopically indistinguishable from those of victims Smith and Durant. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that it would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity for hair strands matching three different victims who had never met each other to be present in one car. On October 2, detectives placed Bundy in a lineup. Durant immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful identified him as the stranger at the Viewmont High School auditorium. Although there was insufficient evidence to link him to the disappearance of Kent, he was charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the Durant case. Bundy was released on a $15,000 bail paid by his parents and stayed in Seattle, mostly living in Kloepfer's house. Seattle police did not have enough evidence to charge him with the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. Kloepfer wrote that whenever they left the house, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. In November, the three main investigators on Bundy's case, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado, and shared information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. While everyone at the meeting, later referred to as the Aspen Summit, was convinced that Bundy was the murderer they were looking for, they all agreed that more concrete evidence was needed before he could be charged with any of the murders. Bundy's trial for the Durant kidnapping took place in February 1976, and he followed his attorney John O'Connell's advice to waive his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. Judge Stuart Hansen Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault after a 4-day bench trial, and after a weekend of deliberation. In June, Bundy was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. However, in October, he was caught hiding in bushes in the prison yard with an escape kit containing road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, which resulted in several weeks of solitary confinement. Later that month, he was charged with Campbell's murder by Colorado authorities. Bundy initially resisted the extradition proceedings, but eventually waived them and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. In June 7, 1977, Bundy was taken from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. Despite the negative publicity, he had chosen to represent himself and was allowed to attend the hearing without handcuffs or leg shackles. During a break, he requested to use the law library and was granted access. While there, he jumped out of a second-story window, injuring his ankle upon landing. Bundy then fled through Aspen, discarding some of his clothing and eventually breaking into a hunting cabin on Aspen Mountain to obtain food, clothing, and a rifle. He became lost in the forest and spent 2 days wandering aimlessly, missing 2 trails that could have led him to his intended destination. He then broke into a camping trailer, taking food and a ski parka. Instead of continuing southward as planned, he headed back north towards Aspen, avoiding roadblocks and search parties. 3 days later, he stole a car from Aspen Golf Course and was pulled over by police officers while driving back into town. Bundy had been on the run for 6 days, and the discovery of maps of the area around Aspen where victim Campbell's body was located indicated that his escape had been premeditated. After being advised by friends and legal advisors to stay put, Bundy decided to plan another escape from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs. He gathered a detailed floor plan of the jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates, as well as $500 in cash smuggled in by visitors, including his ex-girlfriend, Boone. He sawed a hole between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling during shower time and explored the crawl space above, allowing him to make practice runs in the weeks that followed. Despite multiple reports of movement within the ceiling, the jail staff did not investigate. As his trial became a cause célèbre in Aspen, Bundy requested a change of venue to Denver. The judge granted the request to Colorado Springs, a historically hostile location for murder suspects. On December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and nonviolent prisoners on furlough, Bundy piled books and files in his bed, climbed into the crawl space, broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, changed into street clothes, and walked out the front door. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down. A passing motorist gave him a ride to Vail, where he caught a bus to Denver and boarded a flight to Chicago. The jail staff did not discover his escape until more than 17 hours later. After escaping from jail in Colorado, Bundy made his way to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he spent time in a local tavern. He then stole a car and drove to Atlanta, where he caught a bus to Tallahassee, Florida, arriving on January 8, 1978. Bundy initially planned to find a legitimate job and avoid criminal activity, but his efforts were unsuccessful, and he resorted to stealing from women's wallets and shoplifting. On January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University by way of a faulty rear door lock. He first bludgeoned Margaret Bowman with a piece of oak firewood as she slept, then strangled her with a nylon stocking and forcibly removed her underwear. Next, he entered Lisa Levy's room, beating her unconscious and strangling her. Bundy's biting of Levy's buttock and nipple would become a key piece of evidence against him. He then raped her, causing severe internal injuries. Bundy also attacked Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler in adjoining rooms, causing serious injuries but not killing them. Bundy fled the scene after being spotted by a sorority sister. Despite the attacks taking place in a span of less than 15 minutes and with an earshot of more than 30 witnesses, no one heard anything. After Bundy's brutal rampage at the sorority house, police arrived on the scene and began investigating. Initially, the puncture wound on Levy's nipple was mistaken for a gunshot wound, causing confusion among investigators. Despite surviving the assault initially, Levy died shortly after being transported to the hospital. Within an hour, Bundy made his way to a duplex house 8 blocks away, where he attacked FSU student Cheryl Thomas, leaving her with serious injuries that ended her dance career. Bundy left behind a makeshift pantyhose mask and a semen stain on the bed, but there was no evidence of sexual assault. Law enforcement was bewildered by Bundy's swift attack on Thomas after the murders of Bowman and Levy, with Sheriff Ken Katsaris expressing shock and disbelief that the same person would strike twice in such a short time span. Bundy drove 150 miles, 240 kilometers, east to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van on February 8. In a parking lot, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of the chief of detectives of the Jacksonville Police Department, using the name Richard Burton, Fire Department. However, he retreated when Parmenter's older brother confronted him. Later that day, Bundy drove back 60 miles, 97 kilometers, westward to Lake City. The following morning, at Lake City Junior High School, Bundy lured 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach from her classroom under the pretense of retrieving her forgotten purse. Leach was never seen alive again. 7 weeks later, her remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Sewanee River State Park. It was determined that Leach had been raped and had her throat cut. With insufficient funds to pay his overdue rent and a growing sense that the police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee on February 12. He drove westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line after a wants and warrants check showed that the Volkswagen Beetle he was driving was stolen. When Bundy was informed that he was under arrest, he kicked Lee's legs out from under him and ran away. Lee fired 2 warning shots before chasing and tackling Bundy. The two struggled over Lee's gun before the officer subdued and arrested Bundy. During a search of the stolen vehicle, police found 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television set. They also discovered a pair of non-prescription dark-rimmed glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, which Bundy had worn during his encounter with Leslie Parmenter in Jacksonville. Lee, unaware that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, overheard Bundy saying, "I wish you had killed me," while transporting him to jail. In June 1979, Bundy was tried for the Chi Omega homicides and assaults in Miami following a change of venue. The trial was extensively covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be nationally televised in the United States. Despite having 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy continued to handle much of his own defense. However, according to Nelson, Bundy sabotaged the entire defense effort out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion. He seemed more concerned with being in control than with the fact that he was facing murder charges and a potential death sentence. Before the trial, a plea bargain was negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to killing Levy, Bowman, and Leach in exchange for a 75-year prison sentence. Prosecutors were open to the deal, as they thought the prospects of losing at trial were high. Bundy also saw the plea deal as a tactical move to avoid the death penalty and wait for the evidence to disintegrate, witnesses to die, move on, or retract their testimony. He could then file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure an acquittal. However, Bundy ultimately refused the deal because he couldn't face the world and admit his guilt. According to Mike Minerva, a member of the defense team, he just couldn't do it. During Bundy's trial in Miami for the Chi Omega murders and assaults, key testimony was provided by Chi Omega sorority members Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy near the sorority house, and Neeton Neary, who saw him leaving with the murder weapon. Forensic odontologists Richard Seviran and Lowell Levine matched impressions of bite wounds Bundy had inflicted on Levy's buttock to castings of his teeth, providing further incriminating evidence. In less than 7 hours, the jury found Bundy guilty on July 24, 1979, of the Bowman and Levy murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 2 counts of burglary. The trial judge imposed the death penalty for the murder convictions. 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Leach. Once again, Bundy was found guilty in less than 8 hours due to the eyewitness testimony of someone who saw him leading Leach to his stolen van. Material evidence, such as fibers found on Leach's body and in the van, also matched fibers from the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the penalty phase of the Leach trial, Bundy used an obscure Florida law that allowed a marriage declaration in court, in the presence of a judge, to constitute a legal marriage. He proposed to Boone, who had testified on his behalf during both trials, and she accepted. Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. Bundy received his third death sentence on February 10, 1980, and upon hearing the verdict, he stood up and exclaimed, "Tell the jury they were wrong." This final death sentence would eventually be executed almost 9 years later. In October 1981, Bundy was named the father of a daughter named Rose, who was born to Boone. Although conjugal visits were prohibited at the Florida State Prison in Rayford, inmates were rumored to have bribed guards to allow them to spend time alone with their female visitors. Following the Leach trial and the start of his lengthy appeals process, Bundy conducted a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. In an effort to avoid the stigma of confession, he spoke mostly in the third person as he began to reveal details of his crimes and thought processes. During these interviews, Bundy disclosed his past as a thief, admitting to Kloepfer's suspicion that he had shoplifted most of his possessions. He revealed that the act of possessing stolen items was his ultimate reward, and this motive extended to his rapes and murders as well. He explained that sexual assault allowed him to totally possess his victims, and while he initially killed to eliminate the possibility of being caught, murder later became part of the thrill. Bundy's fascination with murder was confirmed in his conversations with FBI Special Agent William Hagmaye, who noted Bundy's deep, almost mystical satisfaction in committing the act. Bundy considered murder a form of possession and believed that he and his victims were forever connected. He considered himself an amateur killer in his early years, moving into his prime or predator phase around the time of Healy's murder in 1974, indicating that he may have begun killing even earlier, though he never explicitly admitted to doing so. Prison guards discovered 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Bundy's cell in July 1984. He had sawed through a steel bar in one of the windows and glued it back into place with homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, he was found with an unauthorized mirror and was subsequently moved to a different cell. Bundy was also charged with a disciplinary infraction for communicating with John Hinckley Jr., another high-profile criminal. In October 1984, Bundy reached out to Keppel and offered his expertise in serial killer psychology to aid in the hunt for the Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway. Keppel and Detective Dave Reichert interviewed Bundy, but Ridgway remained at large for another 17 years. Keppel documented the Green River interviews and later collaborated with Michaud on another analysis of the interview material. In early 1986, an execution date of March 4 was set for the Chi Omega convictions, but it was stayed briefly by the U.S. Supreme Court before being quickly rescheduled for July 2. In April, Bundy confessed to Hagmey and Nelson, revealing the full extent of his crimes, including details of what he did to some of his victims after their deaths. He revisited crime scenes to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their bodies until putrefaction forced him to stop. He decapitated approximately 12 victims with a hacksaw and kept a group of severed heads in his apartment before disposing of them. He also applied makeup to Smith's face and washed Ames' hair. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals halted Bundy's July 2 execution less than 15 hours before it was scheduled, and sent the Chi Omega case back for review due to various technicalities. These included concerns about Bundy's mental competency to stand trial and an erroneous instruction given by the trial judge during the penalty phase, which required the jury to break a 6-6 tie between life imprisonment and the death penalty. These issues were never resolved. Bundy was then given a new execution date of November 18 for the Leach sentence, but the 11th Circuit Court issued a stay on November 17. In mid-1988, the 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy, and in December, the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling, despite dissents from Justices Thurgood Marshall and William J. Brennan, Jr. A firm execution date of January 24, 1989, was set shortly after that final denial. Bundy's case had moved quickly through the appeals courts, with no delaying tactics from his lawyers. With no further reasons to deny his crimes, Bundy agreed to speak openly with investigators. He admitted to committing all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides for which he was the primary suspect, along with 3 additional victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon whom he declined to identify. Bundy also revealed that he left Manson's corpse on Taylor Mountain but incinerated her head in Cloepfer's fireplace. Keppel and Nelson both noted Bundy's infatuation with his crimes and his total lack of compassion. Bundy admitted to detectives from multiple states that he had committed more homicides than he was previously charged with, some of which were unknown to police. He described his modus operandi of bringing victims to his Utah apartment to reenact scenarios from detective magazines. Bundy's new strategy was to withhold information, hoping to use it as leverage for another stay of execution. This plan, called Ted's Bones for Time scheme, only solidified authorities' determination to carry out his execution on schedule. Bundy's supporters lobbied for executive clemency, but the families of his victims refused to petition for a postponement. Bundy's former girlfriend, Boone, was devastated by his confession and moved back to Washington with her daughter. On the eve of his execution, Bundy talked of suicide, but he was executed by electric chair on January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. His last words were directed at his attorney and Methodist minister. Following his execution, revelers celebrated outside the prison, and Bundy's ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range, as specified in his will. Bundy was an incredibly organized and cunning criminal who used his extensive knowledge of law enforcement tactics to evade detection and arrest for several years. He committed his crimes over a wide geographic area, with his victim count rising to at least 20 before investigators realized that they were dealing with the same perpetrator. Bundy preferred to use blunt trauma and strangulation as his methods of attack because they were relatively quiet and could be accomplished with common household items. He avoided using firearms due to the noise they made and the evidence they left behind. He was a meticulous planner who scouted out his surroundings in detail to find safe locations to abduct and dispose of his victims. Bundy was also adept at covering his tracks and minimizing physical evidence. Despite extensive investigation, no fingerprints or other conclusive evidence of his guilt were ever found at a crime scene, a fact that he used to maintain his innocence for many years. Bundy's generic and essentially unremarkable physical appearance was also a significant obstacle for law enforcement, as was his ability to change his appearance easily. Police found it difficult to identify him from photographs because he looked different in almost everyone. In person, subtle changes in his facial hair or hairstyle could significantly alter his appearance, and he often concealed his distinguishing feature, a dark mole on his neck, with clothing. Even his car, a Volkswagen Beetle, proved difficult to pin down as witnesses described its color in various conflicting ways. Bundy was well aware of these factors and used them to his advantage to evade capture. According to FBI experts, Bundy's modus operandi developed over time and became more organized and sophisticated, a pattern commonly observed in serial killers. Initially, he would forcibly enter a victim's residence at night and use a blunt weapon to attack them while they slept. As his methods evolved, he began employing various tricks to lure his victims to his vehicle, where he had pre-positioned a weapon such as a crowbar. Bundy was known for his good looks and charming demeanor, which he used to gain the trust of his victims and others in his daily life. In situations where charm was not effective, he would pose as a police officer or firefighter to invoke authority. After overpowering and bludgeoning his victims, Bundy would restrain them with handcuffs and transport them to a pre-selected secondary location, where he would rape and strangle them. Bundy often burned the victims' clothing to minimize the chance of leaving evidence at the crime scene. He also revisited the secondary locations to engage in acts of necrophilia and to dress up the corpses. Bundy was known to take Polaroid photos of his victims, stating that he did not want to forget his work. Bundy also consumed large quantities of alcohol while prowling, as it helped diminish his inhibitions and sedate the dominant personality he feared might prevent his inner entity from acting on his impulses. Toward the end of his killing spree in Florida, he began attacking sleeping victims indiscriminately. Bundy targeted white, middle-class females between the ages of 15 and 25, with most being college students. He avoided approaching anyone he had met before and purposely stayed away from Cloepfer when he felt the urge to kill. While some have speculated that Bundy's first girlfriend triggered his killing spree, he denied this and stated that his victims were chosen based on their youth and beauty. After his execution, many young women who had corresponded with Bundy became deeply depressed, believing they were his only one. Rule noted that even in death, Bundy continued to harm women, and they must come to terms with the fact that they were conned by a master manipulator. Bundy underwent numerous psychiatric evaluations, with varying conclusions from experts. Initially, Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatry professor, diagnosed him with bipolar disorder, but later changed her impression multiple times. She suggested the possibility of multiple personality disorder, based on witness accounts of Bundy seemingly transforming into a different person. However, the majority of evidence pointed towards antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, also known as sociopathy or psychopathy. Bundy displayed several personality traits typically found in ASPD patients, such as superficial charm, lack of guilt or remorse, and manipulative behavior. He was evaluated as 39 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, revised, PCLR. Narcissistic personality disorder has also been proposed as an alternative diagnosis in some retrospective analyses. Despite the varying diagnoses, most experts agreed that Bundy exhibited a lack of empathy or remorse, making him a true psychopath. On the day before his execution, Bundy gave an interview to James Dobson, a psychologist, and the founder of the Christian evangelical organization Focus on the Family. During the interview, Bundy made new claims about the role of violence in the media and pornography in his crimes, stating that his addiction to violent pornography gradually led him to seek more graphic and explicit material until he wondered whether actually committing the acts would satisfy him. He also claimed that violence in the media, particularly sexualized violence, was responsible for leading boys down a similar path to his own. Bundy suggested that the FBI should stake out adult movie theaters to follow patrons as they left. He believed that society should do more to address the issue of addiction to pornography. While Nelson believed Bundy's claims, most biographers and researchers have concluded that Bundy's sudden condemnation of pornography was merely a manipulative attempt to shift blame by catering to Dobson's agenda as a pornography critic. In a letter to Rule, Bundy stated that he had never purchased true crime magazines and had only picked them up 2 or 3 times. He also told others that pornography played a negligible role in his development as a serial killer. Bundy's motives for blaming pornography and media violence were viewed with skepticism by many observers. Some saw it as yet another manipulative tactic to avoid taking responsibility for his crimes. Bundy's statements only served to shift the blame away from himself and onto society. Rule and Ainsworth observed that Bundy consistently refused to take responsibility for his actions and instead placed blame on external factors. Despite confessing to 30 murders, he never owned up to any of them, even when given the chance to do so before his trial for the Chi Omega killings, which could have spared him the death penalty. He shifted the blame onto a variety of scapegoats, including his abusive grandfather, absent biological father, mother's deception about his parentage, alcohol, the media, police, whom he accused of planting evidence, society at large, violence on TV, and ultimately, true crime magazines and pornography. He even claimed that television programming, which he mostly watched on stolen sets, brainwashed him into committing credit card theft. In one instance, he even attempted to place blame on his victims, stating in a 1977 letter to Chloe that some people radiate vulnerability and invite abuse by expecting to be hurt. Bundy consistently underestimated the impact of his actions on society. He believed that people were only aware of themselves and therefore would not notice when one of his victims went missing. Additionally, he found it difficult to comprehend that witnesses had seen him at incriminating locations because he assumed that people did not observe each other. Bundy often expressed confusion as to why he was being targeted, displaying a lack of understanding about the gravity of his crimes. According to Lewis, he had no sense of the enormity of what he had done. Keppel noted that serial killers often deny their guilt and build walls of denial that are difficult to break down. Bundy's lack of awareness of his actions was highlighted by Nelson, who observed that each time he confessed, he had to overcome a significant psychological barrier that he had constructed within himself. On the eve of his execution, Bundy admitted to 30 homicides, but the exact number of his victims remains unknown. There have been estimates as high as 100, and Bundy himself occasionally made comments that fueled speculation. In 1980, he told Ainsworth that for every murder that was made public, there could be another that wasn't. When FBI agents suggested a total of 36, Bundy hinted that the actual number was higher. Later on, he told Nelson that the commonly accepted count of 35 was correct, but Keppel stated that both he and Bundy knew the true number was much greater. According to Rev. Fred Lawrence, the Methodist clergyman who administered Bundy's last rites, Bundy himself may not have known how many he killed or why. Bundy reviewed his confirmed victim count with Hagmeye, state by state, the night before his execution. The total was 30 homicides. Washington, 11, including Parks, who was abducted in Oregon but killed in Washington, 3 unidentified. Utah, 8, 3 unidentified. Colorado, 3. Florida, 3. Oregon, 2, both unidentified. Idaho, 2, 1 unidentified. California, 1, unidentified. Here is a chronological summary of the 20 identified victims and 5 survivors. 1974. Washington, Oregon. January 4, Karen Sparks, also known as Joni Lentz, 18, was bludgeoned and sexually assaulted while she slept in her bed. She survived. February 1, Linda Ann Healy, 21, was bludgeoned, abducted while she slept, and then decapitated and dismembered post-mortem. Her mandible was found at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. March 12, Donna Gail Manson, 19, was abducted while walking to a concert at Evergreen State College. Bundy claimed he left her body at Taylor Mountain site, but it was never found. There is speculation that the partial remains of an unidentified female discovered near Eatonville, Washington, on August 29, 1978, could have belonged to Manson. However, remains and clothing were destroyed on May 10, 1985, before a positive forensic identification could be made. April 17, Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, disappeared after attending an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College. Her skull and mandible were recovered at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, vanished from Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon. Her skull and mandible were recovered at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. June 1, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien. Her skull and mandible were recovered at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. June 11, Georgianne Hawkins, 18, was abducted from an alley behind her sorority house at the University of Washington. Her skeletal remains, identified by Bundy, were recovered at Issaquah site. July 14, Janice Ann Ott, 23, was abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight. Her skeletal remains were recovered at Issaquah site in 1974. July 14, Denise Marie Naslund, 19, was abducted 4 hours after aught from the same park. Her skeletal remains were recovered at Issaquah site in 1974. Utah. October 2, Nancy Wilcox, 16, disappeared in Holiday, Utah. Bundy claimed he buried her body near Capitol Reef National Park, 200 miles, 320 kilometers, south of Salt Lake City, but it was never found. October 18, Melissa Ann Smith, 17, vanished from Midvale, Utah. Her body was found 9 days later on a hillside in Summit Park. October 31, Laura Ann Aim, 17, disappeared from Lehi, Utah. Her body was discovered by hikers in American Fork Canyon. November 8, Carol Durank, 18, narrowly escaped abduction in Murray, Utah. November 8, Deborah Jean Kent, 17, disappeared after leaving a school play in Bountiful, Utah. Bundy claimed he left her body near Fairview, Utah, 100 miles, 160 kilometers, south of Bountiful. Minimal skeletal remains, one patella, were found and positively identified by DNA as Kent's in 2015. In 1975, several women were victims of abduction and murder. On January 12, Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared from a hotel hallway in Snowmass, Colorado. Her body was discovered 36 days later on a dirt road near the hotel. On March 15, Julie Cunningham disappeared on the way to a tavern in Vail, Colorado. According to Bundy, her body was buried near Rifle, 90 miles west of Vail, but was never found. On April 6, Denise Lynn Oliverson was abducted while cycling to her parents' house in Grand Junction, Colorado. Bundy claimed to have thrown her body into the Colorado River 5 miles west of Grand Junction, but it was never found. On May 6, Lynette Dawn Culver was abducted from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho. Bundy claimed to have thrown her body into what authorities believe to be the Snake River, but it was never found. On June 28, Susan Curtis disappeared during a youth conference at Brigham Young University. Bundy claimed to have buried her body near Price, Utah, 75 miles southeast of Provo, but it was never found. In 1978, in Florida, several young women were attacked. On January 15, Margaret Elizabeth Bowman was bludgeoned and then strangled as she slept at the Chi Omega sorority at FSU. Lisa Levy was also bludgeoned, strangled, and sexually assaulted as she slept at the same sorority house. Karen Chandler was bludgeoned as she slept at the Chi Omega sorority but survived, as did Kathy Kleiner, who was also bludgeoned as she slept at the sorority house. Cheryl Thomas was bludgeoned as she slept 8 blocks from Chi Omega, but survived. On February 9, Kimberly Diane Leach was abducted from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida, and her mummified remains were found near Sewanee River State Park, 43 miles west of Lake City. Bundy is suspected of multiple unsolved homicides and disappearances, with some potentially never identified. In 1987, he admitted to Keppel that there were some murders he would never talk about, as they were committed too close to home, family, or involved young victims. Minutes before his execution, Bundy was questioned about unsolved homicides in various states, to which he provided inaccurate directions to Susan Curtis's burial site in Utah but denied involvement in any open cases. In 2011, Bundy's complete DNA profile was added to the FBI's database for future reference in these and other unsolved cases. One of the cases that potentially implicates Bundy is the disappearance of Anne Marie Burr in 1961 when she was 8 years old. An unknown tennis shoe imprint was found at the Burr house, which was on Bundy's newspaper delivery route, and her father saw Bundy in a nearby construction site ditch the morning of her disappearance. Bundy also claimed during audio-taped discussions with journalists that he had stalked, strangled, and sexually mauled his first victim, an 8-year-old girl, in an orchard, which was near the Burr family's home. Anne's mother wrote to Bundy in 1986, accusing him of killing Anne, to which he denied any involvement. In 2011, forensic testing of material evidence from the Burr crime scene yielded insufficient intact DNA sequences for comparison with Bundy's, leaving his potential involvement speculative. In 1966, Lisa E. Wick and Lonnie Ree Trumbull, both 20-year-old flight attendants, were attacked with a piece of lumber as they slept in their Seattle basement apartment. Trumbull died as a result of the attack, and Wick suffered permanent memory loss. In 1977, police compared Bundy's fingerprints to those found at the crime scene, but they did not match, so his involvement remains unconfirmed. However, Keppel noted many similarities to the Chi Omega crime scene, and the crime's modus operandi was comparable to Bundy's earlier verifiable assaults on murder victim Linda Healy and survivor Karen Sparks, who were attacked while in their Seattle basement apartments. In May 1969, Pennsylvania college students Susan Marguerite Davis and Elizabeth Perry, both 19, were found murdered in the woods near Somers Point, New Jersey. They had been on their way back to Pennsylvania after vacationing in Ocean City, but they stopped at a diner in Somers Point before disappearing. Their bodies were found 3 days later, tied to trees with their hair. Davis was naked, but Perry was fully dressed except for her underwear. Bundy attended Temple University at the time of the murders and reportedly did not move west until after Memorial Day weekend. Although he told forensic psychologist Art Norman that his first murder victims were 2 women in the Philadelphia area, there is no official record of any such crime. Biographer Richard Larson believed that Bundy used his feigned injury ruse to commit the murders, but the case remains open, and Bundy is considered a strong suspect. On July 19, 1971, Rita Patricia Curran, a 24-year-old elementary school teacher and part-time motel maid, was raped, strangled, and bludgeoned in her basement apartment in Burlington, Vermont. While no concrete evidence places Ted Bundy in Burlington on that date, retired FBI agent John Bassett proposed him as a suspect due to the location of the motel where Curran worked and the similarities to known Bundy crime scenes. Bundy admitted to Keppel that he murdered a young woman in 1971 in Burlington, but denied involvement in the Curran case. However, in 2023, the Burlington Police Department announced during a press conference that they had used DNA from a discarded cigarette butt found at the crime scene to identify Curran's next-door neighbor, William DeRoos, as the culprit of the slaying. Joyce Lepage, a 21-year-old undergraduate at Washington State University, was last seen on July 22, 1971. 9 months later, her skeletal remains were found in a ravine south of Pullman, Washington. She had been wrapped in 2 military blankets and bound with rope, with a sizable piece of green shag carpet covering her remains. She had been stabbed 3 times in the chest, and the FBI confirmed her cause of death through a forensic examination of her bones. Multiple suspects, including Bundy, have never been cleared, and he was seen on campus at the time of the disappearance in a yellow VW Bug. Whitman County authorities consider Bundy a suspect, but he neither confirmed nor denied his involvement in the murder when Keppel brought it up in January 1989. In 1972, Carrie Mae Hardy, a 22-year-old married woman, went missing while hitchhiking from Capitol Hill, Washington, near Seattle. Her mother reported her disappearance to the Seattle Police Department. On September 6, 2010, her skeletal remains were found by construction machinery in a shallow grave at a site that was once heavily wooded and used for logging. Mae Hardy's DNA was obtained from family members in 2004 and matched with the DNA from the skeleton in 2011. Her identification was announced 2 days later, and her family made plans to bury her remains. The location where her body was found was near where Bundy disposed of his known victims, and she matched his supposed victim preference. However, Bundy denied involvement in her death, and Ridgway has not commented on the case. Noted forensic psychologist Dr. Park Dietz has expressed skepticism regarding Bundy's involvement. Rita Lorraine Jolly, 17, went missing on June 29, 1973, after leaving her home for a walk in West Lynn, Oregon. Vicki Lynn Haller, 24, disappeared on August 20, 1973, from Eugene, Oregon, after getting into her car at a parking lot en route to her apartment. Although Bundy confessed to 2 murders in Oregon, the victims' identities were never confirmed. Detectives suspected that Jolly and Haller were the victims, but Bundy was never available for an interview. Both women remain missing. Catherine Mary Devine, 14, was kidnapped on November 25, 1973, and her body was found the following month in the Capitol State Forest near Olympia, Washington. Brenda Joy Baker, 14, disappeared on May 27, 1974, near Puyallup, and her body was found a month later in Miller Sylvania State Park with her throat slit. Bundy was suspected of committing both murders, but he denied any involvement. In 2002, DNA analysis led to the arrest and conviction of William E. Cosden for Devin S. murder, but Baker's case remains unsolved. Sandra Jean Weaver, 19, was last seen on July 1, 1974, in Salt Lake City, Utah. Her naked body was discovered the following day near Grand Junction, Colorado. It is unclear whether Bundy mentioned Weaver during his death row interviews, and her murder remains unsolved. Melanie Suzanne Susie Cooley, 18, disappeared on April 15, 1975, after leaving Nederland High School in Colorado. Her beaten and strangled body was found 2 weeks later in Coal Creek Canyon, 20 miles, 32 kilometers, away. Gas station receipts placed Bundy in nearby Golden on the day of her disappearance. While some consider her a victim of Bundy, authorities in Jefferson County, Colorado, continue to treat her homicide as a cold case due to inconclusive evidence. Shelley K. Robertson, a 24-year-old, did not report to work in Golden on July 1, 1975. Her nude and decomposed remains were discovered 500 feet, 150 m, inside a mine on Berthoud Pass near Winter Park Resort in August by 2 mining students. Clear Creek County Detective Bob Denning questioned Bundy about the Robertson case in Salt Lake City in 1976, but Bundy refused to talk about it. Although gas station receipts placed Bundy in the area at the time, there is no direct evidence linking him to Robertson's murder, and the case remains open. Nancy Perry Baird, a 23-year-old gas station employee from Layton, Utah, disappeared on July 4, 1975, and is still classified as a missing person. Her suspected kidnapping did not fit the pattern of Bundy's past crimes, and he explicitly denied involvement in this case during his death row interviews. Debbie Smith, a 17-year-old, was last seen in Salt Lake City in early February 1976, just before the Durank trial began. Her body was found near the Salt Lake City International Airport on April 1, 1976. Although some sources list her as a victim of Bundy, her murder officially remains unsolved. Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair at the Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida on January 24, 1989. Despite the terror he caused and the lives he took, Ted Bundy's legacy serves as a reminder to stay vigilant and seek justice for all victims of violence.